I am very excited to be here, mostly because I was hoping to finally win at that ridiculous game. Thank you, Sam. But next time, actually, or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, I'll do it again, and that time I'm definitely going to cheat. Don't know how I'll do that, but that's my current plan at least. Before we get too far, let me go over this big question I know is pressing on your mind, which is, who is this guy? So my name is Adam Cuppy. I run a consultancy called Zeal, this fancy logo that sits upon my chest. And we are application specialists. So what we do is web and mobile applications, specifically working with other engineering teams to help either better process, deliver features you can't get to. We're kind of like backlog vacuums. So the stuff that's always high on the list, but you just can't seem to get to, and you really need some experience getting there, that's exactly what we do. So if any of your companies fit that mold, you're trying to hire, can't hire fast enough, have too much to do, and really could use some experience, please give me a call. At the end of this, come see me. I'd love to talk with you at the very least to see what you're doing. Going a step back, you can definitely tweet at me. I am on the Twitters. My Twitter handle is down here at the bottom, and you can find me there. If there's anything that you found fascinating or interesting, I definitely want to hear about it. And similarly, if there's things that you're questioning or you're like, that didn't make any sense, keep it to yourself. No. Please, by all means, let me know. Hit me up on Twitter. I would love to get the feedback as much as possible. All right. Now, before we get too far, I want to talk about this little topic here called documentation. And so, just a show of hands real quick. So, how many of you love writing documentation? Look around the room. These are the liars. No, just kidding. No, I know. No, so raise your hand that you love writing documentation. At times, I do too. No, totally. So, I mock, but I agree with you in a lot of extent. Now, raise your hands if you're the opposite, that you just don't enjoy doing documentation. Okay, so most of you just have no idea whether or not you love it or hate it. How many of you don't do it at all? Like, it's just not a part of your world. You just don't ever have to write it. You just never have to. Okay, how many of you have to write it for every single thing that you do? I want you to raise your hand if you know what documentation is. Excellent. Okay, perfect. I mean, if you're anything like me, basically this is my just generic and bottom line feeling on the topic, which is I am incredibly grateful and thankful for those that put the effort and time into it. One of the many things that I absolutely love is like the sheer amount of documentation that exists in really well-vetted libraries. As an example, Rails. Sometimes, and I really do mean this, I don't say this in a form of mockery at all, I will literally go to the Rails documentation just to read through as a form of subconscious appreciation. Because I realized truly in 2008 when I was introduced to the entire Rails framework and the Ruby ecosystem, without that it would have been really hard to find my way and navigate this map of what this code base was all about. Yet at the same time, I'm that same person that is this way about it most of the time. It ends up to be the kind of the downside of the work that I do, and so I kind of find this to be really troublesome. And I was thinking about this a little bit because, if I was to put my love of documentation on a spectrum, and I was to say, the amount of time that I spend writing documentation against how likely I am to punch somebody. In the beginning, it's, really unlikely that I'm going to punch anybody in the face because the documentation is really light. But, as things start to progress, it gets a little more likely that you might want to just stay away. I might want to just put it in my Slack status, just say, I'm writing documentation, leave me alone. But by the time that I get really deep into it, the reality is you're going to get a punch in the face. And if we get too far deep into it, I'm probably going to burn this whole code base down and run for the hills, right? So again, documentation is a love-hate relationship. Steve Klabnik, I found this on the ever-loving Hacker News, that the very first line is, writing documentation is really hard. And he goes on to basically explain why. And later, I found this too, that most people don't find writing docs to be fun. This is this guy. And open source is largely driven around doing what's fun. And I found this really fascinating, ultimately, that there is this kind of personal and psychological dichotomy that exists between the difference of the value that we might get out of it on literally a daily basis against the amount of effort and love and appreciation we have for doing it ourselves, right? So, this is generally what I think about writing docs myself. It's this constant state of, trying to do it well. I want to write the perfect explanation to everything, but I just can't seem to figure it out. And vice versa, sometimes I use libraries where this is basically what it feels like reading the documentation. It's like, couldn't you just give me a little bit more clarity as to what the heck I'm trying to use? Can't this be a little simple? And then you find that really awesome blog post out there that basically breaks it down into the simplest possible form. Now, just coincidentally, the very next talk is about system tests, which if you've ever had to integrate system tests into a Rails app, you've probably burned your code base down in the process. And so I got to give a massive amount of props to Eileen, who's going to talk about the next word, 5.1, that integrates it into Rails as a framework, because it is just like this, getting it going in an app. It is horrible. Okay, now we're going to diverge a little bit and talk about this person, potentially real individual. This is a gentleman named William Shakespeare. Approximately 400 years ago, over the course of about 30, 40 years, he wrote a whole series of works. A whole series of works. This here, you can't really see it on the screen because things are a little blurred out, but this is the Norton Shakespeare. So about 400 years ago, when Shakespeare was writing the plays, actually taking an even farther step back, at the time, most of the works were actually performed specifically for the Queen. And so of all the plays, of which he wrote comedies, tragedies, and history plays, a lot of them were meant to illustrate the times, but a lot of them had a lot of politics baked into them. Now, what was really interesting was that it would be considered heresy or an act against the Queen and the crown to say anything that was not necessarily favorable. However, if it was kind of subjective as to whether or not it was or wasn't, it could kind of slide by. And William Shakespeare was infamous for creating these really complicated, very poetic pieces that, raise your hand if you've heard of William Shakespeare. Right, exactly. We all have. I can bet that, I don't know if you're not from the United States of America, but if you weren't, I bet you still put your hand up. Right? His work has been translated into literally hundreds of languages.
Right.
/ England. Sorry. Anyway, his work has been translated many, many, many times. So here's what I did, is I ran this little rig task. That isn't real. And here's what I found, is that in all of his works, this individual wrote over 800,000 words into his pieces. 800,000 words. Now, some of you might also know this, but of those 800,000 words and phrases that were used, 1,700 of which were used in that context for the very first time. They were words that had meant something totally different prior, now meant something new, and even to this day, we still use many of these word forms in the same context that William Shakespeare used them for the first time in his works, right? 1,700, okay? Now here's what's really fascinating to me, and this is the origin of this talk, and you might have read this in the abstract, is of 800,000+ words written 400 or so years ago, 1,700 word forms, 43 different pieces, do you realize that there is basically no documentation? None. That's right. Complex fight sequences, choreography, words that have never been used before, totally being redefined. He respelled words that were common to the English language at the time. All of that. And 400 years later, and there is no documentation. So how does that work? Right? We can't write a Rails app or a gem of 200 or 300 lines without feeling like we have to document some methods. Right? So how did this work? This is the big question that was floating around in my head time and time again. So we're going to explore that a little bit, but first an action round. So here's the first thing I'm going to need you to do. If you've got your computer open, you can close it, and I need all of you to scoot forward. Find a seat up front. Yeah, all of you, come on, scoot forward. Make it quick, I only got so much time. Scoot forward. Get out of your seat, see the open ones. Come find one. Come find one. You're my audience. You're my groundlings. My groundlings. Okay, come forward. Move quickly. Move quickly. I need 5 people to raise their hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, and a 5th. 5. I need you 5 to come on up. You shall be Gregory. Come yonder. You shall be Samson. That's ironic. That's just total drive that. You shall be Abraham. You shall be Benvolio. And I need a fifth. Where's my fifth? And my fifth. You. Yes, sir. Yep, you in the gray. Perfect. You shall be my Tybalt. All right, so before we get too far, we need to start with we need to move ourselves into the time of the Shakespeare, right? So while you're reading, read intently. We need to move ourselves into the time of Shakespeare because, like I said, you are my groundlings. Can I hear it from my groundlings? Can I hear it from my groundlings? Absolutely. Now here's the thing, just like a Ruby Minute, this is, at the time, the plays were not something that you would just passively watch. That's right, for a very small amount of money, you could come in and you could throw things, you could do all sorts of stuff. Don't do any of that, but you can absolutely make noise. That's right. So can I hear it from my groundlings? Excellent. All right, so you are my audience for today, and these are your players. I would like to introduce you to the RubyNation players. Can we hear it for our players? Can I hear it for my players? Players, excellent. Now, today we shall be doing a scene for you today. It is from the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet. And I know what you're thinking, who's going to be Romeo and who's going to be Juliet? But ha ha ha, that's not the scene we're doing. But another thing that you should know, because this is quite interesting, at the time, it was illegal for women to be on the stage, so all roles were performed by men. So if it was, in fact, a woman, let's say Lady Capulet, it was performed by a guy. So this example is we've got a bunch of women on the stage who are playing men, and we have men on the stage that are playing, well, men. But you shall know that it does not matter. The responsibility of all the players is to be very, very loud. You must project all the way to the audience because, remember, we're 400 years ago and there were not mics, so you are not as lucky as me. And so everybody in an audience had to be able to hear. The only way to do that was to project. So you have to talk as if you were talking to the very back of the room, not to these fair groundlings in the front. Yes, players?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. The last thing you must do is make large and grand gestures. Why? Because I said so. Large and grand gestures. Large, grand gestures. Large, grand gestures. If you're told to fight, make sure you fight, but safely, all that stuff. Okay. Now, my groundlings, this is the play, and these are the players. One more time, can I please hear from the groundlings for the RubyNation players? We open in Verona. My players, please.
'Tis well thou art not fish. If thou hadst been poor John. Draw thy tool. Here comes two of the house of the Montagues.
My naked weapon is out. Quarrel, I back at thee.
How? Turn thy back and run?
Fear me not.
No, marry, I fear thee.
Let us take the law of our side. Let them begin.
I will frown as I pass by, and let them take it as they list.
Nay, as they dare. I will bite my thumb at them, which is a disgrace to them if they bear it.
It means fuck you.
Do you bite your thumb at us, sir?
I do bite my thumb, sir.
Do you bite your thumb at us, sir?
No, sir, I do not bite my thumb at you, sir, but I bite my thumb, sir.
Do you quarrel, sir?
Quarrel, sir? No, sir.
If you do, sir, I am not for you. I serve as a man as you. Well, sir.
Say better. Here comes one of my master's kinsmen.
Yes, better, sir.
You lie.
Draw, if you be man, Gregory. Remember thy swashing blow.
Part, fools! You know to put your swords away. You know not what you do.
What? Art thou drawn among these heartless hinds? Turn thee, Benvolio, look upon thy death.
I do but keep the peace. Put up thy sword, or manage it to part these men with me.
What, drawn and talk of peace? I hate the word, as I hate hell, all Montagues in thee. Have at thee, coward.
And they fight to the death. Well, not really to the death yet, but they fight. And can I hear it from the groundling? Stand and give your praises to the people. Come. Our players. Very wonderful. Nicely played. Nicely played. Oh, perfect. So, this is what they had to read. And you notice that of a lot of things, when we kind of take a deeper look inside of Shakespeare, like that there is a few things that we can note, right? A few things that are interesting about the way in which he would structure this, right? Ultimately, I'll get to the ultimate statement, which was the documentation is in the code, right? The code is the documentation, right? It's indicating certain actions and events, certain ways to think. It sets up and establishes different patterns, and those patterns have meaning. When those patterns are disrupted, the meaning changes, and it indicates to things like the actor that, oh, something new is going on. So looking at this a little bit more, I'll break this down into what if Shakespeare did write Ruby? Well, first, the objects would own their reactions. And here's what I mean, and this is kind of a fun, funny little example, which is if we're looking at Samson and Abraham, they own their reactions, right? Oftentimes we think in our code that an object is going to own only its action, right? It's going to do a thing, and that's it. Well, in reality, it owns its reaction to something, right? My naked weapon is out. Well, okay, that's great, but what does that mean in context? Well, when we start to break down the text, we realize in the following languages that they start to fight, right? What does "bite my thumb at you" mean? Well, that actually has older resonance than even the work, but the importance of it, and even to today, what it interprets to and how we interpret it as actors and as players, that is informed entirely by the text, right? So the next is pattern disruption tells a tale. And we're going to start with this. Raise your hand if you've heard of iambic pentameter. That is awesome. Raise your hand if you know what iambic pentameter actually is. Oh, fantastic. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, the easiest way to think about it is metered verse, right? So in a poetic phrase, not all, so in a poetic phrase, it might be broken up into effectively 5 sets of 2 syllables each, right? A foot, right? So it looks something like ba-boom, 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 right? If you were to look at it in an actual line, it would read and emphasize something like this. And again, that's the point, is that it's meant that on the stressed syllable, that word has more importance. This creates a pattern. So when I do count the clock that tells the time. This is why sometimes you'll hear, if you've ever heard Shakespeare, that there's this sense of patterned verse that exists, right? There's some sort of rhythm that exists within it, and it's not just about rhyming, right? Well, the reason why this exists is for a few things. Number one is in the English language, our language is loosely structured this way to sound this way, so it creates, again, a sense of harmony and a sense of melody inside the language itself that creates a sense of tone. What this allows for is psychological conditioning in the mind so that we can get past the differences in the language itself, right? So instead of the mind having to constantly trying to interpret what it's hearing and listening to all at once, instead what it does is it gets conditioned to the tone, and so now all it has to do is listen to the new interpretation of that tone. Now similarly, if we look at this line from Hamlet, to be or not to be, that is the question, there's a couple things that are important here, which is, number one is to be or not to be, right? That is done in the same beat, ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom. But then it's changing, right? And the emphasis is actually put on that, and this is just simply done because that being the important word, and the clearly important word over is, right? But then if you notice, so 1, 2, 3, 4, that is the question. There's an 11th beat. Okay, so it's breaking the pattern, right? What this is doing is ultimately telling the actors as well as the rest of the audience that there's disruption here. If we were to interpret this, basically it's to die or not to die. This is the point in Hamlet where he's questioning whether or not he should kill himself. Well, arguably that, but we'll make that simple, make it in that simple tone, right? And what this is ultimately allowing to do is to set a new sense of tone, again, tone and style and disruption that tells the audience that something new is happening. And more specifically is by leaving the sentence or the phrase on a downbeat, right? Question. What that's also doing is it's leaving it in a weak state, right? And you'll see again if you kind of listen to Shakespearean actors and so forth that they'll start to emphasize these things. Now, what does this mean inside of code? Well, like I said before, this is about pattern disruption, right? That it tells a tale. Well, if we look at Ruby, there's a lot of things like that, right? Like, so let's look at this. This fun little example of, Abraham asks, there's a method ask, and it takes a string. Do you bite your thumb at us, sir? Well, what happens, and let's say that all this string does is basically, prepend Abraham and, creates a string and passes it out. Who knows? Simple example. Well, what happens if we put a bang on the end of this, right? Now, we have to define that method, of course, But if in our code we're starting to do these things where we're disrupting the pattern, what can we start to create as expectations? Now, what are some of the things Ruby already does in terms of its standard library, in terms of how it has defined what a bang at the end means? Mutation, what else? Alternatives, or it could possibly throw an exception. Right? So there's this incredible liberty that exists inside of the Ruby language. And not to say that necessarily Shakespeare would write a method called ask, but the point being that but by setting up a pattern and setting up a common convention throughout your code, when you disrupt that pattern, you can create new meaning that provides new context to the developers and other individuals that are in it, right? Another one is declarative abstractions. So, as an example, this is a line from the last scene, which is my naked weapon, which is reference to an unsheathed sword, right? This indicates that we have a sword that is out. Here's what's kind of cool. If you've ever seen a modernized version of a play, Shakespeare play, sometimes this provides the opportunity to change effectively the interpretation of what that means, right? So now this might be a gun versus a sword, when there wasn't guns at the time. It could be one of many different things. Right? What this ultimately allows is the imperative side to be interpretable, right? Whereas the declarative side is not. This is the intention. The rest is left for you to define. Similar, like I mentioned with to be or not to be, which is referring to die or not to die. By simply not making, should I kill myself or not kill myself, right? This is allowing for that interpretation to exist as well and be relatively abstract, yet be highly declarative. So ultimately, in boiling this down, if Shakespeare wrote Ruby, it would come down to establishing patterns, disrupting those patterns, establishing events, and objects not only watching out for those events, but controlling their reaction to those events, right? And then the last would be setting up a tone and intention throughout the entire code base that you could follow. So that's it. That's a minute and 50 seconds over. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions, please let me know.